Welcome in. It is Big Ten today. Great to have you with us, Dave Revson and Anthony Heron. We are a few weeks away from having a playoff feel, bit of a calm before the storm feel here.
I like how in the intro to the show, you really set expectations pretty high for my Impact 5, that West Division. I'm going to make complete sense of it. So you just wait. We had a little foreshadowing there.
Complete sense.
Yes, there's a lot to live up to, but I plan to do so.
Everyone will agree with everything you said.
I mean, how could they not? Makes perfect sense. It'll be very simple, trust me.
All right, Pat Forty is with us from Louisville as well and doing double duty. Pat Forty was at that doubleheader of hoops last night in Indy. He traversed the roads of Kentucky and Indiana to get back in time to join us. You ready to change your focus to football here, Pat?
Oh, yeah, I'm back. You know, Dave, in these uncertain times, I will say this show controls its own destiny, okay?
There we go.
The next hour, we got it under control, unlike the Big Ten West.
No one in the Big Ten West. Yes. No, it's all in our hands right now. And that's a good thing or a bad thing. Time will tell. We'll let you know in an hour.
Shall see.
As to how it goes. Let's get to our big story, though, and it is those college football playoff rankings. No changes in the top 5 this week. Ohio State and Michigan remain at 2 and 3. Georgia is first, TCU fourth. So that'd be your top 4 as of now. Tennessee still checking in at number 5. Oregon's loss to Washington dropped the Ducks 6 spots, meaning the teams behind them moved up. Penn State is now 11th. Illinois dropped out. Pat, it feels to me like there are 9 teams still in the hunt. The top 7, pretty obviously. And then I don't think you can count out Clemson or North Carolina yet at this point. I mean, just depending on how things play out and if teams ahead of them were to stumble, one of them could be a one-loss conference champion. You agree with that? Is that kind of what you see, 9 playing for 4 at this point?
Yeah, I think so, Dave. I mean, you could make a case that the ACC is definitely the longest shot there. Right. And needs more help than anybody else. But if they do end up with a 12-1 champion, if Notre Dame ends up 9-3 and that loss doesn't look as bad for both Clemson and North Carolina, both of whom lost to Notre Dame, that helps them a little bit, but it also would help an Ohio State as well. So, you know, where they stand right now, they're a little bit more on the outside. But, yes, I think that there are obviously the 2 from the Big Ten. There are 3 from the SEC. There's TCU. There's USC. And then there's the ACC pair.
And it would require a little bit of history. There's never been a team who's been outside the top 10 at this point in the rankings to end up in the top 4 for the college football playoff rankings, you know, once we get to the final version of it. But I do agree. I think the ACC is still alive. There's a heartbeat. It's just, you know, perhaps a bit dim at this point. But when you look at the Pac-12, you know, a conference that seemed like it was in a really strong position just a week ago, as tends to be the case as this advances and we get week by week into the rankings. Now the right teams lose, and so, you know, I suppose you could look at it as the cream rising to the top, or USC just being the last best hope for the Pac-12 conference. You know, they've still got 5 ranked teams, but they begin to lose to each other, to sort of eat each other up, and now here the Trojans still in a strong position. I think if USC wins out, they're going to be in the college football playoff because of what remains out in front of them, and then they'll have that conference championship to end up perhaps supplanting someone else ahead of them.
Easier said than done, though. Really challenging schedule here down the stretch for USC, starting with that game against UCLA. So takeaways there, I think we kind of all agree 7 are in reasonably strong shape. You got 2 others maybe on life support. Any other big takeaways outside of the Big Ten, Pat? Obviously, we'll get to the Big Ten and dive into Michigan and Ohio State here. But is there anything else that jumped out at you from this reveal that was some sort of a light bulb moment?
Yeah, not a lot at this point. But I will say, like Penn State moving up like ahead of Oregon. That was interesting, and that does buttress the argument for a potential one-loss Big Ten East team. One of them is going to lose, Ohio State and Michigan. And now you've got to win over a team that continues to move up in the rankings there. So I think that that's somewhat significant and interesting of where they are. And then beyond that, I think TCU has just done a very good job of solidifying their spot. Even if they lose, they're still going to be in contention. I don't expect them, if they're 12-1 or 11-1, to get in, but they're going to at least be in the argument. Winning at Texas in a game that they were a touchdown underdog, I think was pretty impressive and just kind of adds to a pile of pretty good wins in a good league. It's a deep league, but it's not a spectacular league, so they don't have the huge head-to-head victory maybe, but they've got a lot of good victories and obviously no losses.
I agree for the most part, Pat. I do find it noteworthy that TCU, undefeated, best team in the Big 12 up to this point, hasn't been able to leapfrog Michigan, and that's with the non-conference schedule and the perception of its weakness for the Wolverines. And so for TCU, I do think one loss, even one loss if they end up winning the Big 12, if you win the Big 12 as a one-loss champion, then obviously that conference championship, when they're comparing not only like resumes, but the like eyeball test, that'll end up giving TCU an advantage over perhaps Tennessee and Michigan if they are one-loss, champ, or really anyone who's perhaps a one-loss team from a Power 5 league who doesn't end up winning their conference. But I do think that one loss, for where TCU's at right now, and especially the fact that they continue to be behind Ohio State and Michigan, I do think one loss could perhaps be very damaging to the Horned Frogs because of the perception that they've carried throughout the season. The resume has been good, but it doesn't feel like there's as many opportunities and as substantial opportunities for TCU to continue enhancing their resume.
They did send a pretty clear message this week, not only winning at Texas, as Pat was talking about, but the manner in which they won. The defense was really good. You go on the road and win. They've got Baylor this week, which is a challenging game as well. It has been interesting, I think, to just kind of hear the way that Boo Corrigan, as the spokesperson for the committee, has changed his tune a little bit on TCU. That it doesn't seem to be dwelling as much on the manner in which they won.
Close games.
Yeah, a little bit more about, hey, they're undefeated and they've won some good games here. So we'll see with TCU again. They still have some work to do as well, challenging games ahead in the Big 12. I do want to dive into the Big 10. And Pat, you started to touch on it a little bit, but this is where I think it gets really interesting. And you wrote about this week in the 40-yard dash, talking about Michigan and the non-conference schedule. And Boo Corrigan was asked again in the media availability immediately afterwards about Michigan and the schedule and the impact which the non-conference schedule has had. By the way, UConn Bowl eligible people, huh?
Right, yeah.
Let's
Jim Moore in his first season.
Let's not sell the Huskies short. But look, they canceled the series against UCLA. It's been noted they still have a very weak strength of schedule nationally, all joking aside. To what degree do you believe that could come back to haunt them were they to lose to Ohio State?
I think it's a significant risk for sure. If they lose that game, first of all, you're not going to get a 13th game. And then everybody has made a point of looking and saying, this is the non-conference schedule you chose. You had a game against a big-time opponent. You got rid of that. That was your choice, and you replaced it with another weaker opponent. And if you look, say, at the Sagarin ratings, Michigan out of the top 25 has the weakest strength of schedule. The second weakest is UCLA because they got hurt by dropping that game as well. And so I think that's the kind of thing that the committee, obviously, they have taken note of it. And if you're trying to split hairs more or less between up to as many as 5 one-loss teams for 2 spots, that could be a deciding factor. I don't know if it will be. If they play a classic game in the horseshoe, if it comes down to a 4th and 1, getting it by an inch again for Ohio State, and they win in a nail-biter, Michigan may well have both the look test and the resume that says we need to be in. But you lose that game by a touchdown, 2 touchdowns, more, whatever, then I think they're all the more susceptible. It's just they've left that opening that could come back to haunt them.
And I can feel Wolverines fans maybe viewing this segment with a bit of a glower right now because we're only discussing it through the lens of if Michigan loses, because right now they would be in more jeopardy because of the non-conference schedule. It's not a prediction that Michigan's going to lose to Ohio State, but whomever ends up being perhaps a one-loss team, assuming they both get through the contest they have this week, enter that game undefeated, Ohio State has Notre Dame as something they can hang that pelt on the wall right now for defeating a ranked Irish squad that's continuing to enhance their resume, and Michigan just doesn't have that right now in their non-conference. So that's why this discussion, I think, is important for whether or not, if there's more carnage, if more teams, if TCU goes down, if USC gets another loss, that sort of thing, then who's the conference that has an opportunity to maybe get a second team into that mix? And that's where Michigan's non-conference puts them in more jeopardy for that. And so that's why I think the focus of this conversation is perhaps along those lines. And I think from either perspective, a one-loss Big Ten champ would certainly have a case to make, but a one-loss non-Big Ten champ, that's where you got to go to the other portions, the other segments of that resume. But, for them to continue having Michigan in that top 3, and frankly, you hear a lot of folks discussing whether or not the Wolverines should even be ranked ahead of the Buckeyes. I do think there's a level of deference and respect that's being paid to Michigan, even in the midst of that non-conference schedule. And guys, you think back to when the college football playoff first came about, the thought was everyone was going to look for these magnificent non-conference opponents and how that would bolster your resume. But now with leagues beginning to go to a 9th conference game, having that additional difficult data point, not only for whether or not the team is excellent, but it's a team that knows you. It's a team that faces you on an annual basis in a lot of these cases. So just conference games are hard. Conference games can be really, really difficult, even if it's a team who your talent may be beyond there. So leagues started to go away. Like Michigan wants another home game. So they said, we're going to make sure we have more home games during the regular season than we do away games. That was a big factor in why they went away from the UCLA series.
This is challenging, of course, and part of it just will come down to who are you going to be compared to. I mean, if you're being compared to a one-loss Tennessee that also doesn't have a conference championship, maybe the equation is a little bit different than if it's a one-loss USC that does have a conference championship. Kind of, let's see how all this plays out.
And the Illini faltering here lately, so Michigan doesn't have that opportunity. This could have been a really nice opportunity for both squads. It's still a great opportunity for Illinois, but as far as a playoff resume booster, it won't have the same effect for Michigan.
It does beg the question. I don't want to get too far afield here, Pat, but I am interested kind of as we play off of that notion of the non-conference schedule and what's the best way to handle it. And there's kind of some art and some science to it. Anthony, I think you make a good point. I came into this whole thing thinking we were going to have these marquee non-conference games. And if you recall, in the early years after the CFP was announced, there was this rush to schedule big-time non-conference games. And then it became apparent that the committee really puts an undue amount of weight on that number in the loss column. And that if it's larger than one, at least up until now, you're not going to get in. We'll see what happens potentially.
Think of Oregon
with LSU. Absolutely. Think of Penn State had a year where they could have been that team. And so I think people started to rethink it. So in your mind, what's the right way to handle this, Pat? Like, how do you try to thread that needle between we want to have at least a schedule that doesn't get laughed at, as I think for better or for worse, and whether it's fair or unfair, Michigan's is to a certain extent this year, versus one that is competitive enough that it will get us in and not be frowned upon, but not so competitive that we won't suffer that loss.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult balancing act for sure. I mean, I think teams really should look to schedule at least one really good non-conference game. Even if you're playing 9 conference games already, you should schedule one opponent out of conference from a power league, and especially, preferably, a good team from a power league. If you're scheduling Colorado, that's not going to help you that much. If you're scheduling Georgia Tech, But, I just still think that even if you're running a risk of losing, it's going to help you, certainly if you win, and not hurt you as much if you lose. I just judging specifically from the way this committee has reacted to Michigan in this situation, well, to Anthony's point, they've kept them in the top 3, but it just keeps coming up every single week. They had a choice, and this is what they chose. And if they do slip, if they falter and lose that one game, will this come back to be a deciding factor? I don't envy necessarily coaches, athletic directors for trying to find the right formula for a schedule, because it really can be tricky. But I think bolder is ultimately better than not.
And the committee, those 13 people, were the combination of just the human element of watching the games and using the metrics. Even a metric like game control, I do think is a little bit flawed, because, you look at Georgia or Ohio State. I feel like Michigan's number 4 in the game control metric, but I don't think either of those teams has controlled games more than the Wolverines, but the scoreboard doesn't always indicate it, because there's more ball control, there's more time, clock control. They run the football more effectively, and so Michigan isn't a squad that's going to pick up chunk play passing touchdowns to the same extent. And of course, their defenses continue to grow throughout the season, so they're 4th in the game control metric, when in my opinion, they should probably be 1st, because they've dominated their opponent in a way that no one else has.
Well, I don't want to get into this. This is a conversation for another day, I would
Get
say.
Jerry sitting right here maybe for that one?
No, I'm just saying, like, what metrics they use and the amount of weight they put on them. Game control may matter to one person, it may not matter to another. There's no clear-cut criteria for what metrics we how we weigh each metric that is at our disposal.
It's an art, Dave. It's an art.
It's a mess, is what it is.
Where's Donato? Give me coach in here.
Regulation, not enough. One overtime just won't do either. Michigan State gets a big-time win, beating number 4 Kentucky 86-77 in a double overtime thriller last night. Got game-saving dunks to force each overtime and then pulled away in the second OT. Tom Izzo pleased with his team's resilience.
I've been through a lot of wins and a lot of losses, and a lot of tough losses and a lot of incredible wins, but this is special. You know, it's special because we feel like we've got to recapture our culture a little bit and our players, and and those guys did a heck of a job. My staff did a heck of a job. It was a program win for Michigan State University, and I'm happy about that and excited about it.
That gets us to today's big stat. It was Michigan State's 3rd straight season with an AP Top 5 win. Only Texas Tech has a longer streak nationally, and they have a significantly longer one. Amazingly, the Spartans now have 5 wins against the AP Top 5 while being unranked themselves over the last 3 seasons. No one else in the country has more than 2 such wins. Our colleague Mike DeCourcy, also of the Sporting News, is joining us now. He was courtside last night. Mike, great to talk to you. Put that win into perspective for us. I mean, we know where Kentucky was ranked. We also know Oscar Tshiebwe is just coming back from an injury. This was his first game back. So how do you put it into perspective? How significant was this?
Well, first of all, by March, it goes on your resume. And even if you want to drill down, you go and look at the stats and you see Oscar played 30-plus minutes and had 22 points and 18 rebounds or whatever the exact numbers were, somewhere in there. And you say, well, that was a pretty good win. I don't think there are going to be many that look back, many on the committee that look back and say, gosh, well, Oscar hadn't practiced much. I don't think it's going that far. This will be a win over a team that's battling for a 1 or 2 seed, and it'll certainly help the Spartans in whatever they're trying to achieve relative to the selection committee. I think it also was, Tom was talking a lot about his culture and how he felt that they got a little bit away from that during COVID and how important this was for that. And right now, this is a team it's really surviving and thriving on its culture because the toughness that they showed and the resolve that they showed is a lot of what they have. They don't have a lot of great offensive options. With Jaden Akins having missed so much of the preseason, I really thought he was going to be a breakout star for them on a team that needs that. With Max Christie leaving a little prematurely for the NBA draft, they were kind of left without that guy, and I thought Jaden would step into that, and he's not really been able to yet. So they've had to have Malik Hall step forward and maybe be a little bit more offensively than he should be. Joey Hauser was terrific last night. Kentucky didn't do a great job defensively with Joey. Gonzaga did. Now, Joey said it was about playing on a boat, and that's why he couldn't make a shot there. But Kentucky left him open, and if you leave that guy open, he's going to make shots. But what happens when they don't leave him open? Where do the baskets come from for the Spartans?
It does feel like he has taken a significant step, game on the boat aside. Mady Sissoko as well. I mean, it's just a completely different player than he was a year ago. And I just kind of philosophically, big picture on Michigan State, you talk about their culture and toughness as a big part of that. I would say another big part of it is they are, and I think sometimes this comes across as a negative term, but I mean it in the most positive sense in the world, they are a developmental program. I mean, if you can be an elite program and a developmental program at the same time in college basketball, I think they're one of the few programs that still does that, where Tom, I mean, he'll dip into the transfer portal. It's not like he's completely opposed to it, Tyson Walker being an obvious example on this team. But if he had his druthers, guys would stay for several years, and they wouldn't play a whole lot early on if they weren't ready for it, and then they would get better and better, as we've seen with Sissoko as maybe being a prime example. I guess that's a long preamble to saying, can you still do that in this day and age of college basketball? Can you be elite and compete for national championships and not dip into the portal constantly?
Yeah, I think you can. But, I mean, let's not forget Michigan State not only has Tyson, but Joey was a transfer as well. So I don't – but having those guys in the program for multiple years is important. And also when you get a guy like Max Christie, it really helps if that player stays until he's fully developed and doesn't just go at the first opportunity. And that's been increasingly rare in college basketball over the last few years, especially with the name, image, and likeness. Unfortunately, this league got hit by it a couple of times. The two players at Michigan and Max being good examples of guys that really could have gotten a lot out of playing as sophomores. In the case of the Michigan guys, they could have gotten first-round status if they'd done it. So I think that if this Michigan State team had Max Christie, I would have had them in my top 10 without a doubt. As it was, I still think they're a top 25 team. I will tell you that late in that game, win or lose, I tweeted out, Sporting News had Michigan State in their preseason top 25. Anybody else, raise your hands. Don't be shy. Because I just don't see how you look at a team with that many returning players under Tom Izzo and say, not enough.
Yeah. We'll get a better sense for them. Obviously, the schedule's crazy. So you got Villanova coming up this week. You got Alabama after that. Still Notre Dame. I mean, it's insanity, but that's just kind of what Tom does. I want to move on to some other teams. Purdue played last night. I understand, obviously, you were covering these other games, and so probably didn't get a chance to dissect it. And it's hard to know how good Marquette is at this point, but Purdue was trailing for much of the game and then rallied in the second half to win. Braden Smith was really good. I mean, you look at some of this young backcourt with Lawyer and Smith. You add in the big guy, Edey, who really took over the game in the second half. How good do you think Purdue can be?
I still think Purdue could win the league. I'm not saying they are going to win the league. It should be based on talent, Indiana. But Purdue has enough to win the league if everybody gets it just right, if the freshmen continue to advance and develop. They haven't last night they did not play to their absolute best because they'd get more out of the veteran perimeter players if they were at their best. But they were competitive as Purdue teams need to be, as they typically are under Matt. They didn't allow that game to get away from them, even though they were struggling to make shots, struggling to generate baskets. I think when you have two freshman guards like Fletcher Lawyer and Braden Smith, who are playing this well to this point in the season, you have a lot of promise. And it's just a matter of finding the right formula to incorporate everybody, to make sure everybody's comfortable in their role. Matt does that really well. And again, I've said this before, this will be an easier trip to that destination than it was a year ago when they just had too many guys. They don't have too many guys now. They have just enough. Now, when you have just enough, you don't want anybody to get hurt because then you can't really replace it. But they're in a position now where I strongly believe that they will be among the leading teams in the league by the time we get to February and March.
And they will test themselves as well. They head out to the Phil Knight Legacy in Portland next week, so that should be really interesting. Some big-time games out there. Obviously, they had Jaden Ivey, Travion Williams. Those guys have moved on. At Wisconsin, Johnny Davis has moved on. As we look at them last night, they really struggled with Green Bay. I mean, inside the arc, they couldn't get anything done. Tyler Wall was in foul trouble for a lot of the game, and I do think that was a big part of it. Survived, won the game, but where do you see Wisconsin at this point in the season?
Well, I think there's a lot of similarity, not in the style of play in terms of the player, but Tyler Wall's importance to Wisconsin now has become more or less equivalent to what Johnny Davis was a year ago. He's got to play and he's got to excel for them to compete with the best teams and for them to succeed. And he has to this point in the season until last night. He's been terrific. Last weekend, Friday night, he was outstanding. One of the best players on that night in any game. And so I don't worry much about struggling a little bit in a game where he's not on the floor a lot. Obviously, he's got to avoid those situations as the games get better, or he's not going to be out there. If he's not out there, they're not going to be successful in challenging the better teams. But what we've seen early in this season affirms what I thought coming in, which was 9 was an awfully low projection for any Wisconsin team that has returning players like Wall, Crow, and Hepburn.
And history tells us they will get better. They always do. They've got a big one, Battle for Atlantis, coming up. They will take on Dayton in the opening game there. Again, this is the week coming up here where I think we learn a little bit more about some of these teams. I'd include Maryland in that group. They won last night. They've had 3 straight blowouts. It was Binghamton, last night. It's early for Kevin Willard. The schedule probably helps him in terms of getting some lower pressure situations as he tries to get his system put into place. Any early impressions, though, on what we've seen from Willard's team?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that they have been terrific defensively. Not against great teams, but uniformly terrific in all three games. Making sure that the other team doesn't get quality shots, making sure they don't shoot a high percentage. You want to see, when you change coaches, you want to see a little bit of a culture change. And that's not typically been Maryland over the last decade. They haven't been an oppressive defensive team. That's who Kevin's teams generally are. That team that is going to guard you and make it no fun for you. And so we've seen that to this point. Now that will be really tested when they play St. Louis this weekend. St. Louis is a terrific team. Travis Ford's done a nice job. It's kind of unheralded because they haven't been in the tournament, but they've done a really nice job there at St. Louis year after year since Travis has gotten there and really gotten it going. They hung 90 on Memphis last night. And so that's a great challenge for Maryland to see where that defense stands as they continue to progress.
A really big gauge there for the Terps. The next big night of hoops in the Big Ten is Friday. There are some really good games. Indiana and Illinois, the two highest ranked teams in the league, will both be in action. The Hoosiers get Xavier. Where are you with Indiana at this point? Are they the best team in the Big Ten, in your opinion? Certainly they have the fewest question marks, I would say, of anyone in the Big Ten. They're the highest ranked team? Are they the best team?
Most talented team and the team with the highest ceiling, without a doubt. If they hit their ceiling, no one in the league can get there. You can drag them down if you play a certain way and are successful on that night and get the calls, etc. But if they're at their ceiling, they're the best team in the league. And to this point, Miller Kopp has shot the basketball pretty well, and that's a big key for the Hoosiers. They need to shoot the basketball well with all the other assets that they have. Nobody in this league has three big guys they can rotate like Race Thompson and Trace Jackson and the freshman. They've got the great point guard play from both spots, Jalen Hood-Schifino, as well as Xavier. They've got everything that they need to be significant, and now it's just a question of finding a formula and applying it. And Friday night will be a great test. They go to Xavier. The Cintas Center will be electric. They've got a veteran team that has really hungry because this group has not been in the NCAA tournament. And so they'll be very excited to have a top 10 team on their court. The fans will be ecstatic. It is a tough place to play when they get it going. So I think it's a terrific test for the Hoosiers. And if they can pass it, it'll say a lot about where they're headed. That
should be a good one on Friday night. Illinois plays UCLA on Friday night as well. And kind of a similar story. They haven't really played anybody to this point. But, man, Illinois has been fun to watch, Mike. I mean, they are getting up and down the court. They really play with pace. It's a little bit different than when they were dumping it inside to Kofi because they have these bigs who can run the floor a little bit better, which nothing against Kofi. It's just a different style of play. Terrence Shannon obviously has just been phenomenal to this point. Again, competition limited, but what do you make of the Illini in advance of that game against UCLA?
Well, this is what Terrence Shannon came to Illinois for. He wanted that opportunity to be a star, and not because he wants the glamour, glory, whatever, but he wants to be that first option. He wants to show that he can handle it. At Texas Tech, there was a egalitarian approach to offense. It was kind of slow. This is what he wants to play in, and it's why he's here. And they've got the ball moving so quickly. Sky has been a terrific addition. And now you play against a team with a veteran wing to deal with Shannon in Jaime Jaquez. You've got a veteran point guard in Tiger Campbell to deal with Sky. So it's going to be interesting to see how that holds up. I believe that game is in Vegas on a neutral floor, so you don't have to worry about necessarily making your first big test on somebody else's court. So I think that's good for the Illini, that they don't have to cope with that. They can just cope with the fact that the other team is really talented, really experienced, well coached, and see how they measure up to that.
By the way, that's a conference game 2 years ago, or 2 years from now, I guess I should say. So, yes, sign me up for that one in 2 years. I'll be happy to cover it. Mike DeCourcy, always great stuff. Look forward to lots more of this as the season continues. But thanks for shedding some light on Big Ten hoops to this point.
You bet, Dave. Great to see you.
All right, my friend. Likewise. Back on Big Ten today, Illinois and Michigan, a matchup of two elite defenses on Saturday in Ann Arbor. Wolverines now first in the nation in scoring D. That's a title Illinois held for much of the year. The Illini have dropped to third. They're the top two teams nationally in total defense as well. And Pat, a couple weeks ago, this looked like a titanic battle, possibly a Big Ten title game preview. Illinois obviously is slipping a little bit. What do the Illini need to do to have a shot in this one?
Well, you got to hope that Chase Brown can go
Yeah.
for starters. You know, they're a great running back. If he's not there as the centerpiece of that offense and carrying the ball 25, 30, 35 times, it's really tough sledding. Tommy DeVito's had a really good year. They've had some guys on the outside make some plays, but not a good recipe to try to go up against Michigan without being able to rely on an established running back who can break some tackles, who can make some tough yards. If you don't have that, I just think it's going to be a really tough game for them. Then you just got to hope that this turns into a field position, low play count kind of game, and you can just hang around and hope for a few turnovers maybe to turn the tide.
I agree, Pat. And, beyond Chase Brown, Josh McCray still banged up as well. So both the top running backs, and they've spent the bulk of the season without Josh McCray, but they've had Chase Brown there to take so much of the offensive load. And so if you don't have either of them, or even if you do, but neither one of them is really close to their usual selves, then it can make for a long road for the Illini. But I think it's incumbent upon Brett Bielema to make sure he reshapes the conversation to his team around this game, that they recognize this isn't about being disappointed for the season and where we're at this moment. It's not about the outside expectations that really grew as the Illini began to perform and execute with such excellence. Brett Bielema has to make sure his team recognizes that whether it's we're ahead of schedule or even if you're not talking schedule, just recognize what you've accomplished in this individual season. And a lot of it has been about toughness. That going into that Minnesota game, the Illini were banged up and the Gophers were coming off of a bye week, and a physical Minnesota squad got pushed around, got out-executed, out-precisioned by Illinois in that game. I think reshaping the focus and the message to the team is going to be important.
I'm with you 100%. I mean, I think even if you lose this game and you go out and you beat Northwestern, you win 8 games, and then go to a really good bowl, to me, 2 years in, that's pretty remarkable. Now, it is disappointing because you wonder how many shots are they going to have where the Big Ten championship game is right there for the taking. I think that's the hard part of it. When you think about where they were 2 weeks ago and where they are now, it's hard not to look at that and say, man, we had it right there completely in our own control. But that being said, I'm with you. I mean, there's obvious momentum behind the program. It's a shame that they're not coming into this game at full strength, and we'll see where Chase Brown is. But to your point, Pat, so much of what they've done this year has revolved around him. Similar question with Ohio State, Maryland, and Pat will give you the first word here. For the Terps to stay in this game against the Buckeyes, coming in playing really poorly, Maryland is. These last 2 weeks have kind of been, no pun intended, but a shell of their former selves. Where do you see Maryland having a chance?
It's a worthy pun.
What needs to happen? It started to come out, and I realized how awful it was, but I couldn't stop it.
I'm not going to pull it in at that point. We're good.
Yeah. What are you supposed to do at this point, right? Pat, what would Maryland have to do, in your opinion?
I've written enough bad puns. I respect it.
I just wanted you to know it was totally unintentional until it started, and I realized where it was going, right? Yeah. Anyway.
I think they're just going to have to manufacture some big plays in the passing game. You're going to have to hit some shots. You're going to have to take the shots and hit the shots. Maybe even come out with some gadget plays, that sort of thing. I just think that you're not going to be able to sustain drives, and you're not going to be able to keep up with that Ohio State offense unless you can produce some splash plays and try to get some easy scores. So not an easy recipe for success there. The best thing I think Maryland could have going for them possibly is Ohio State looking ahead. Now, Ohio State, look, they've done a great job in terms of, I think, just handling the schedule as it's been presented to them week after week after week. But we also know they've been dying to play Michigan for a year. That game stuck in their cross so much last year that you get this close to it, it's tempting to peek ahead. I don't anticipate that they will, but if you're Maryland, that's really what you're hoping for.
They would love Maryland, a game with no inclement weather, because the last two contests have really shown the difficulties that their offense for this season has in trying to play through inclement weather conditions. They didn't look good against Wisconsin in doing it. They didn't look good against Penn State in doing so. Temperature may be a little bit lower this weekend in College Park, but as far as I can tell, no precipitation, no big wind gusts expected. And so if you at least get manageable weather, then I anticipate we'll see a version of the Maryland offense that we haven't seen in a few weeks. And Mike Locksley's kind of talked about this game in terms of his team feeling like they're backed into a corner, needing to respond. Ohio State has everything to lose. Maryland has everything to gain. And so he is certainly going about the work of shaping the message for his ball club. And I do anticipate Talia Tagovailoa, a very gifted quarterback in an offensive system that he knows well. I'd like to see Dan Enos call their quarterback into more movement. I'd like to see him call him into not only movement of the launch point, but QB run to keep, just like he did with that Michigan defense, keep this Ohio State talented defensive front on their toes and force them to respect the way that he can make plays on the go. Then, as long as there's no rain, I think we can see a Maryland offense that can really threaten this Ohio State D.
You look at the last two games for Maryland, to your point, 10 points, 323 yards, that's total.
Yeah.
That's combined. That's a bad
Shocking.
one game for them, and that's two games. It's interesting, Pat, because on your point that you were making about might Ohio State be looking ahead, I really felt like a couple weeks ago these games set up great for Ohio State and Michigan in that they would get really good tests, and they would be good enough tests that they couldn't look ahead, that you'd be able to sell your guys on, hey, these guys are really good, and they have the potential to beat us. I wonder whether the recent stumbles for Illinois and Maryland make that a little bit of a harder sell.
Absolutely could be the case, Dave. That's part of the job for Jim Harbaugh and for Ryan Day is convincing your team, hey, these are still worthy opponents and we've got to be ready. That's one of the big jobs for a head coach. And even experienced head coaches, I think, sometimes can be tempted like, okay, we're going to work in a couple of periods here against Ohio State's offense or Ohio State's defense, or the other way around if it's the Buckeyes, and the players will pick up on that and they'll know, okay, coach is looking ahead. This must not be that tough an opponent. So this is where guys like Jim Harbaugh and Ryan Day earn their very big salaries. I think it's like you've got to stay focused in right here, and trust me, by 6 p.m. on Saturday or whatever time the game ends, then it's all about the big game. But for now, we got to concentrate on the business that's immediately in front of us.
It is tempting to look ahead. Certainly we can look ahead. And if they're both undefeated, man, it's going to
be fun.
A ton of fun, yes. Big Ten West standings shaping up thusly. A four-way tie at the top with 2 weeks to go. 5 teams still technically in the hunt to get to Indy, though Wisconsin would need a lot of help. No one controls their own destiny, though Iowa and Purdue seem to have the most reasonable paths, assuming Illinois loses to Michigan. Anthony has volunteered to make sense of it all. It is noble. It is courageous. It is his task in this week's Impact 5, ranking the top 5 in the West from 5 to 1. Where are you starting?
Taking the full body of work for this particular season into account, Dave. So not just where they're at.
This sounds like a disclaimer of sorts. Okay.
Well, just letting folks know, man. But it is still irrefutable. It is going to be undisputable where we said, let's start in Madison with the Wisconsin Badgers. I view them as the 5th team in the Big Ten West. All 5 of these teams are going to rank. Are going to be the teams who are in the mix here. But for Wisconsin, we've seen their peak, and their peak involves Graham Mertz throwing the ball at an extremely high level. It involves a run game led by Braylon Allen and Isaac Guerrero that's very domineering, and a defense that takes the ball away from opponents and gets after harassing the opposing quarterback. Has just been very inconsistent for the Badgers. And so for the moment, especially coming off of last week's performance, that's why I have them at number 5.
That seems fair. They have Nebraska this week. Where are you going with number 4?
Number 4, we're going to go to the Twin Cities area, and I ranked the Minnesota Golden Gophers at number 4. This is a team that during the preseason, I expected Minnesota to be the pick to click in the Big Ten West, and they've looked like it at times, still in the mix right now for the Gophers, but their performances have been uneven, and they are banged up right now. That's a part of my factor in having them as low as number 4 right now, because we don't know what's going to happen with Tanner Morgan. Now, I think that because Mohamed Ibrahim has been so good in the offensive line, you can withstand that a little bit. And we've seen that regardless of which quarterback has been in the game. But Minnesota's at number 4 for me.
And when your defense has given up 1 offensive touchdown the last 3 games, you can afford to have some quarterback uncertainty too. They have really turned it around. 3 straight wins for them on the heels of a 3-game losing streak. Okay, so number 3 is?
Number 3, I'm going to West Life for that one. And Purdue's performance throughout really the last couple of seasons, when you look at it, they've been very unpredictable. When Purdue faces a ranked squad like they did last week, we tend to see the best version of the Boilermakers. So they've got a magnificent ceiling. We also see at times when Purdue is facing unranked teams, their performance shows up as being uneven in those contests. But I love the balance. I've talked to you about the balance. I've had dreams about this balance for years for the Boilermakers and Jeff Brown, and now we have finally seen it come to the fore this year with the run game meshed with the passing attack. And Aiden O'Connell, he did not have a third bad game in a row, so I've got Purdue at number 3.
So you're not one who looks closely at the results of the scoreboard when you rank teams. Is that kind of what?
No. Again, the totality of the body of work.
It became clear why you led with that
Right.
disclaimer when you put Purdue at number 3, because when I watched the game this weekend against a team that will either rank 2 or 1 in Illinois, Purdue won. But where are you going with number 2?
Purdue won, but I'm going Illinois at number 2 right now in the Big Ten West Division, and part of that reason is that they were able to outplay Purdue for much of that game, and I'm sure that Illini fans would make the case that, hey, there were some calls that went against us, some outstanding coverage from some of the best defensive backs in the country, and officials just throwing flags that aren't making a whole lot of sense. But that being said, Purdue did win the game, and the Illini have begun to falter here in recent weeks. And that's a part of where Brett Bielema, I think he's got to reshape that message, make sure he crafts the message in a way that their opponent this week, he's got to tell Michigan, we don't play Michigan's brand of football. The Wolverines play our brand of football, and maybe we get back to a version of the Illini that we saw earlier in the year.
So this means you have Iowa at number 1.
I mean, over the last 13 days, Dave, it's been one of the top scoring offenses in the Big Ten Conference. We're seeing a resurgence from the Hawkeyes, and we know how magnificent that defense has been throughout the entire year. There are 3 main phases to the game of football. So if you got the best defense in America and you got the best special teams in America and a growing offense in a division where everybody's just throwing haymakers at each other week in and week out, yes, the Iowa Hawkeyes, as we sit here on this very day, they are the best team in the Big Ten West Division at the moment. We shall see, Dave, with still 2 regular season games to go in the division, what happens from here.
So they're the best of the moment, but you're taking the totality of the year into consideration.
Yes, it's a very complex puzzle that we put together here in the Big Ten.
It is a complex system. They're next to last in the nation in total offense. Only Jerry Kill in New Mexico State. Jerry is looking admiringly.
There is a path here for Iowa that they seem to be
fabulous.
The pick to click.
Fabulous on defense.
2 games to go in the West.
Absolutely.
Who looks more likely to win the West than the Hawkeyes?
Pat, you always get a chance at your rebuttal. What say you about Anthony's rankings?
I mean, I'm still just gobsmacked by the fact that we're sitting here in mid-November and no one controls their own destiny. It just is incredible. But look, I mean, I can't say that this is definitively right or wrong. I would probably put Purdue up at least ahead of Illinois, maybe even ahead of Iowa, simply because they can throw and catch. Nobody else on this list can do that. Aiden O'Connell, while he's had some tough spots, but he can do it. Charlie Jones can catch it. Jeff Brom can scheme it. And I think you're going to have to be able to do that somewhere here in the next couple of weeks to win the division. Iowa, it's just unbelievable what they have done. I mean, to win by 2 touchdowns last week in a game in which you have no plays longer than 19 yards, no drives longer than 39, and you average 2.1 yards a carry? Like, that's magician stuff. I don't know. Phil Parker, unbelievable. Special teams, unbelievable. But I don't trust Spencer Petras in the offense to make enough plays in the last couple of weeks here to win 2 games and get to Indy. So give me Purdue, just, because you got to pick somebody.
I trust Cooper DeJean, Dave.
Ooh,
I do.
Good.
He is spectacular.
You want to talk? He was my Saturday standout. If you watch the final drive,
that was an excellent pick.
Yeah,
that you had as your Saturday standout.
Yeah.
Put him on offense. That is my recommendation. Yes,
he was a quarterback in high school.
Such a high level. He was quarterback, receiver, tight end. He snapped it to himself sometimes. The kid did everything.
It was a small high school.
Very much so.
Yes. But the week ahead in the Big Ten, already discussed the games for Michigan and Ohio State. Other early action includes our game at noon Eastern, Indiana and Michigan State. Spartans can clinch a bowl spot with a win there. Late afternoon window has Penn State at Rutgers and Iowa and Minnesota on Fox. Significant game for that Big Ten West picture that we were talking about. Pat, you mentioned just a moment ago that you don't necessarily trust Iowa to win these 2 games down the stretch. Nebraska is the final game, so I'm guessing that Minnesota is the game where you would forecast they're going to stumble. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, that's a fair assumption. And again, I'm not saying all this with great conviction, but I do think, Minnesota's capable of playing an Iowa kind of game. You want to just, grind it out, low scoring, low possessions, kick, play defense, run the ball. Fine. Minnesota's wired for that too. So if PJ Fleck can Kirk Ferentz, they've got a chance. Mo Ibrahim's going to be the best player on the field offensively. Ride him as far as you can.
Trophies, Dave. Trophies. Pat Floyd of Rosedale on the line. That's going to be the peak of the game to me, regardless of the result, man. Just watching those players carry that 120-pound statue off the field. I had to do it. Try to do it myself at one point. I was a much stronger man back then.
Iowa's won 7 straight in the series. Always a fun show. We will see you tomorrow when Jerry joins me.